Anna McCormack lives and works as a volunteer on the land and waters of Quandamooka country. She is a lifetime left-wing activist feminist. Anna manages the IWD Brisbane Meanjin Facebook page and hosts a number of events and groups, including a direct action protest group supporting women's sex-based rights and a feminist discussion group. She also organises the annual Radical Feminist Conference in Brisbane Meanjin in March and the IWD rally and march in the same month. Anna was a union activist through her working life, serving as a delegate and member of trade union women's committees.
What I'm going to talk about is very different from what Yolanda and Jasmine have spoken about. And it's about policy and legislation and organising, feminist organising against what is coming and what is happening. The next piece of Queensland legislation to set back women's rights, and there have been a few now, will be the establishment of sex self-identification via changes to the Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Act. This is being done at the behest of the gender identity industry, and women have been advised by the Queensland State Government that we're not stakeholders, and we've been denied any input to the changes. So we have a state government that's been ideologically captured by the very powerful gender identity ideology that's swept the capitalist world. For a number of years, the Queensland government has been introducing significant parts of that ideology into state policy across all departments with no media scrutiny and minimal community consultation. They've relied on changes to the Federal Sex Discrimination Act that were made by the Gillard government in 2013, which removed the definitions for woman and man and opened the way for changes to be made in policy and law that prioritise gender over sex as a ground for defence of rights. Unlike other states, we don't have two chambers in the Parliament. We have a single chamber, just the Legislative Assembly. So there's no House of Review in Queensland. As a substitute for a House of Review, and it's a very poor substitute from my experience, we have a parliamentary committee that reviews the bills sent to it by the Parliament and produces a report for Parliament's consideration. From my limited experience in this area, and I've been involved in two matters that have been sent to the parliamentary committee. The first was some years ago, and that was a result of the campaign against the wicked camper van slogans, and we partially won that. But the more recent one was the conversion therapy bill. So from my experience, the parliamentary committee is just a rubber stamp for the government. In a 93-seat parliament, the Labor government has 52 seats and the LNP opposition has 34 seats, 52-34, with a crossbench of 7. So it isn't as if Labor and the LNP are even close in strength. The Labor Party has a strong lead and it can do what it wants. We have a single daily newspaper, the Courier Mail. It's a poor quality Murdoch paper with no interest in investigating political developments that harm women and children. The one journalist who I did have contact with, who had an interest in these issues a few years ago, left very suddenly. Although I've since heard from Stasia from the Coalition for Biological Reality just yesterday that there may be a reasonable contact there at the moment. The particular instance where I had experience of how the parliamentary committee system works was, as I mentioned, through the Queensland government's introduction of the conversion therapy legislation, or as I like to call it, the Born in the Wrong Body law. IWD Brisbane Meanjin was one of 5 feminist groups across the country that put in submissions on this law. All 5 pointed up the dangers of introducing the affirmation approach to children and young people who believe they were born in the wrong body. We were selected, IWDBM was selected to give verbal evidence to the Parliamentary Committee, as were a number of professional organisations, such as the AMA and the Law Society of Queensland. They took the same line that we did, all ignored. There was a small adjustment, minor adjustment. But the other organisations that gave evidence were government-funded organisations representing the interests of the gender identity industry. And some professional associations like the AASW, which is my old professional association, the Australian Association of Social Workers, took a very bad line, predictably. They're gung-ho in favour of conversion therapy. Another of the issues that we've dealt with has been the review of the Queensland Anti-Discrimination Act. So it's an act from 1991. The review of that act occurred last year. It hasn't yet produced an updated act. It was reviewed by the Queensland Human Rights Commission, which, like the Queensland government, is a captive of the gender identity industry. So it was an inappropriate body to conduct the review. And that was the first point that we made in our submission on this legislation. But nevertheless, it did conduct the review and feminist concerns were dismissed. The Queensland Human Rights Commission barely seems to regard women as human, and it seems to have little regard for the safety and well-being of children. This is evidenced by the school's trans guidelines that the QHRC produced for the Education Department, and you can read those on the web, and they're woeful. Also by their submission to government on the conversion therapy bill and the evidence that they provided at the Parliamentary Committee hearing on the bill in 2020. For the review of the Anti-Discrimination Act, the QHRC was guided by a reference group, which was established to ensure that stakeholder views were understood and properly considered during the review, and to enhance engagement between the QHRC and diverse stakeholders about the Anti-Discrimination Act review. The problem was, of course, that women weren't regarded as a stakeholder in the review of the Anti-Discrimination Act. There were 10 people on the reference group. All the groups that are discriminated against were represented, except for women, and except for lesbians in particular. 2 lawyer groups were represented, a church group, the Chamber of Commerce, the Queensland Council of Unions. Women are actually the largest group to make complaints under this act, but women were not seen as a stakeholder group. Neither were lesbians. We were advised that the LGBTQ organisations represented the interests of lesbians, but we know that those organisations don't support lesbian rights to same-sex attraction. No reason was given for why women weren't represented as a broader group. The outcome of the review of the Anti-Discrimination Act will be disappointing to feminists, and predictably so. The Queensland Women's Strategy, for which 3 of us from IWD Brisbane Meanjin made a submission urging a clear definition for woman and the inclusion into the strategy of the provisions of the UN Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. So we recommended that that be incorporated into the Queensland Women's Strategy. But of course it wasn't, and the Queensland Women's Strategy refers to girls and women and men as people of all genders. So the Queensland Women's Strategy was another document that abandoned any support for women's sex-based rights. The Queensland government has developed a habit now of excluding women as a stakeholder group in review of policies and legislation in which we have a strong interest. This applies glaringly in the intended changes to the Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Act, where IWDBM was very upfront in writing to both the Premier and the Attorney General, outlining that we're stakeholders because women, especially lesbians, as well as girls and children, have the most to lose from sex self-ID. Our requests were denied, as was a request from another group of women from the Labor Party and non-Labor Party who made a more recent request for a meeting. We made our request a year ago in June of last year, all denied. So our responses to all of this, and those pieces of legislation and that strategy are indicative of the Queensland government's approach to women's sex-based rights. So the responses I can speak about only from my own perspective. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a doctor or a scientist. I'm not a wonderful writer, although I'm not bad. I'm not a researcher, and I'm not an academic. My contribution to this struggle is based on the skills I've developed as a feminist activist and organiser over several decades, and also the skills I used in a previous life as a feminist community development worker. So I host two groups, a feminist real-life discussion group, it's a secret group, and an activist group for people who are prepared to participate in street activism. We go public with our support for women's rights and kids' safeguards through public gatherings and street marches, and we had one today, actually. In that way, we break the taboo against even speaking of women's rights. So we don't speak a great deal about women's right to organise, although we do. We actually do it. We assemble, we organise, we take to the streets. Our physical presence can inform others of what's happening and encourage them also to speak up. I also support and encourage the women in both of those groups to write letters and postcards to MPs and to put in written submissions on crucial issues. And you don't need to be a great writer to put in a written submission. Some of the submissions that I saw some years ago when the abortion legal situation was being reviewed, the submissions that came from the other side, the anti-abortionists, were absolutely woeful. Doesn't matter. I mean, all of us can write better than they did. And I host occasional in real life events with presentations and discussion. And a lot of these are videoed and then uploaded to the YouTube channel. And the presentation that Jasmine referred to earlier is back again on our YouTube channel after for a little while we gave in and took it down in response to the demands of the ABA. To organise effective street protests and in building meetings, you need a few things. You need a good supply of clear signs. You need a PA and a mic so that no one can say to us, no, you can't hire this from us this time. You need pull-up banners. You need a megaphone or two. You need financial contributions to enable speakers to travel if they live outside Brisbane. So if I'm inviting people to come to Brisbane to speak at events, I like to be able to make at least a contribution to their travel costs. You need enough money to print the occasional coloured flyer for railway station distribution. You need to be able to give donations to other women who might be doing similar things. You need a YouTube channel. You need enough money to be able to pay an editor who will edit the video that we've recorded. You can see where I'm going with this. We need money. Therefore, fundraising, usually in the form of selling feminist merchandise, and you might notice I have a wonderful suffragette scarf on at the moment. A woman from northern New South Wales made these for us to sell. And they're selling for a very reasonable $35. So that takes up a good deal of time fundraising. I wish I could get around it, but I can't. However, even the fundraising activities do build connections, and they prompt discussion, and they strengthen political support, because everyone's encouraged to do what they can. I mean, some women are great at crocheting. I can't crochet. Some women might be really good at doing the videoing. Some women, I discovered today, a real champion as a chant leader, a woman who hasn't done it before, but has always fancied herself as a megaphone woman. And so she was our chant leader today, and she was just wonderful. So she's got the gig from now on. We did have another wonderful chant leader, but she moved to Hamilton Island, so we lost her a little while ago. So I guess one of the things I do is encourage everyone to use the skills that you might already have. And if you want to develop new skills that are needed in the movement, to do that. I'm too old to start developing new skills, so I just use the skills that I've already got. So, for example, the rally that we had today and the one that we had at the end of May enabled any of us who were on side to say, yes, I'll have a go at speaking. So we had, last time we had 8 people speak. Today we had 4 or 5, no crossover. You know, no, they were all different people. And hopefully at our next one, we'll have a number of other different people. One of the women who spoke today, I didn't even know her until our last rally. She came to it. She came to lunch with everyone afterwards. I said to her, you know, how would you, she had a lovely Irish voice. And I said to her, how would you like to speak at the next rally? And she said, I'll think about it. And a few days after that, she sent me an email saying, yes, I'd love to. And she did, and she was fantastic. So people can speak on any aspect that appeals to them. And we had, you know, all different aspects addressed today. So they're the issues as I see them for Queensland at the moment, and the things that I'm trying to do in conjunction with a network of other women and a couple of men to confront where the Queensland government is heading politically right now.
Thank you, Anna. That was awesome. And before I close for questions, where should women write to and to whom? Where can we get that information from, Anna?
In terms of the coming
yeah, in terms of
sex self-identity legislation, the person who has responsibility for it is the Attorney General and Minister for Women, Shannon Fentiman. And look, I will be advertising the postcards soon. I've got 3 different postcards to send. One is to Fentiman, the Attorney General. One is to the Deputy Premier, Stephen Miles. I thought it was fair enough to send him some postcards because he was the one who pushed through the conversion therapy legislation in 2020. And the third postcard has no, it's blank, so you can write it to your local member. But all of those addresses are on the postcard, and I often advertise them on the IWD Brisbane Meanjin Facebook page as well.
That's awesome. And finally, while we're still promoting women to be able to speak, how was the rally today?
It was great. We had, at the first one in May, we had 29 people. Today, including the people who came, saw and stayed for most of the rally, we had about 34. And we had about 25 or 24 who went on the march. We had a great deal of support from the public. It was really good. I mean, it was only a footpath march because you can't go on the road unless you have 100 people. It'll be a while before we get 100. But we had a lot of support from bystanders. You know, they were really attracted by our very clear call flutes. We stopped at one point for about 5 minutes in the mall and just chanted, and a lot of people came up to us. And when they know the issues, they're on side.